Hi, good to be with you.
I think a lot of people would just quite like to see the big idea, and whether people buy into green initiatives. In fairness to Keir Starmer, it did feel like quite a sizable chunk of what he was trying to do, how he was differentiating himself from the Conservatives. Now that has gone, what are we left with? I know what Blair pretty much stood for in 1997. I'm aware of what Thatcher stood for in 1979. I sort of even know what Boris Johnson was meant to stand for, to a degree, in 2019. I'm struggling with Keir Starmer. Can you help us out here?
Well, it's a tough question for a Friday afternoon, isn't it? So I think two things are important to say. The first is that on the green investment policies, the Labour Party has not discarded the policies themselves. So the initiatives around home insulation, retrofitting, getting towards net zero, energy and industrial policy, all of these policies will remain. The mission stays, but they're not attaching the specific £28 billion figure to that. And I understand what you say. Some people will see that therefore as less specific. But it's not about ditching the green policies themselves. It's about rather getting away from having a commitment to a certain figure when there is so much uncertainty about the economic outlook. To take your question, though, in terms of what does this mean about Labour's overall position, look, they're going to fight this election on a commitment to be a more competent manager of the economy than the Conservatives. Now, that, I admit, is not necessarily the most exciting message. But it is, I think, where the country is. People are very worried about their own economic situation. Living standards have been falling for some time, as you know. So I think that's where Labour wants to position itself. And as I say, it may not be exciting or politically innovative, but I think it is where Labour feels the mood of the country is. And obviously, they want to win the election, so they want to fight on that territory.
And I guess, one of the advantages, I suppose, that Mr Starmer has at the moment, in fact, his key advantage is that he's not Rishi Sunak. And he doesn't have to say very much. And opposition parties, if they're doing well in the polls, as Labour are, tend to rather enjoy that position. We don't have to start opening our mouths, coming out with big promises. We can just let the other guys make all the mistakes, and we will reap the rewards come the election. And there's obviously a bit of that going on, which I understand. But there is a point also, Patrick, where we kind of want to see something more. And I think after 14 years of a government, whether somebody is a Conservative voter or a Labour voter or anything else, you want to think that the incoming government is going to be full of big ideas, that they are not just about... we all remember 1997, things can only get better. Well, every incoming government could argue that, I suppose, to a degree. But right now, I think people would like... There is an appetite out there for something bigger than just, well, we'll just make things a little better than they previously were.
Yeah, I mean, I think the inference of your question is entirely correct, which is that there is always a debate. Do governments lose elections or do oppositions win them? But the reality is an election will be powerfully shaped by voters' perceptions of how well the incumbent government has been doing. And whether or not, whatever political position we take, I think there is a general view in the country that the current government has not been performing particularly well. There have been a lot of policy issues that appear not to be well managed. Obviously, the overall economic situation remains somewhat shaky. So, as you correctly infer, I think Labour will be half thinking we should, to some degree, minimise the commitments that we're giving because we want people to focus on how bad the government is. And in reality, that is what will do a lot to shape the outcome of the election. I also would say quickly that I think your historical examples are good. And obviously 1979, Thatcher coming to power, 1997, Blair, they're important examples. But it's also worth noting that when those governments came to power, there was still a lot of uncertainty about their agenda. I mean, even Margaret Thatcher, who had some very definitive ideas, as you know, it took her 3 or 4 years to really, I think, define what her governments and her agenda were going to be about. So I don't think that because Labour doesn't have necessarily a big picture radical story now, it means it will never have one. The reality is it is going to fight this election on a relatively cautious prospectus. I think the question is then when it gets into office, as you said, does it have the radical ideas that are really going to give people the change that they desire?
Yeah, you kind of wonder sometimes when I look at 1997, what was quite interesting there is, as you know, Patrick, the economic books that Blair inherited weren't that bad, actually. You know, the economy was doing kind of OK at that point. Major had gone through some pretty turbulent times, but by 1997, they were pretty much out of the woods, and the employment figures and most other measures, it was kind of all right. So Blair inherited something rather good. Could Keir Starmer find himself in a similar position in that the economy has flatlined, not just here, but lots of other similar-sized economies around the world as well? And whether it be Labour or the Tories, by the time the next election comes, the natural economic cycle will dictate we're about to turn a corner, and Keir Starmer will be the chief beneficiary of that, whether he does anything himself or not.
Well, it is true that in 1997, Labour came to power inheriting an economic and fiscal framework that, in retrospect now, looks like it was a reasonably sound basis on which Labour could then govern. There was some concern about economic growth, and of course taxes had gone up quite sharply in the 90s, which damaged the Conservatives in the 97 election. But I think you're right that the general premise was Labour could build on what already existed, and to a large extent it did that, although it did go in some new directions. It did eventually raise taxes. It did put public investment into major public services. I think this time around, obviously, the concern is the economic foundations are more fragile. But I think, to speak to your perhaps note of optimism, I think there is a feeling that if the British economy has a period for a few years of greater certainty, we don't have this constant coming and going of different prime ministers, different chancellors of the exchequer, not just the personalities, but also more stability around the overall policy framework. But actually, there is a lot of potential in the British economy, which can then be revived, and we do start to see some quite rapid improvements in terms of the overall rate of growth, and that feeds through into people's living standards. So, yeah, I think you could start to see quite a significant improvement quite quickly, which would come in part from having that greater political stability, greater certainty around investment decisions than perhaps what we've had over the last 3 or 4 years, when, again, I think, regardless of your political persuasion, you would accept that there has been too much volatility and too much uncertainty.
Indeed. Patrick, thank you for your time. Really appreciate that. Great to talk. Patrick Diamond with us, former Labour advisor.